He writes an award-winning blog called News Munchies with Ted Corless, addressing the decriminalization, medicalization, and reformation of America's marijuana laws. Mr. Corless is a former correspondent with Al Jazeera America, CNN, and Fox News, and now spends his time traveling and speaking on the marijuana question, as well as working with individuals and companies who are active in building the industry. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Mr. Ted Corless.
Thank you, Justin, very much. Let me say, I did something very smart this morning. I left my example at home, and that was when I spoke to the paralegals luncheon a few months ago. I came into the luncheon with 19 grams of cannabis, and I brought with me a scale. In the event anyone in law enforcement was there was going to argue that I was over the 20-gram limit for cannabis. So anyway, hello again. My name is Ted Corless, and I'm on a journey. I've been on a journey for about 5 years now, addressing what I refer to as the marijuana question. The truth is, despite the fact that 29 states in the United States have taken steps to legalize marijuana, it is just as illegal today as it was in 1996 when the very first state, California, passed Proposition 215. And since then, as many states, numerous states have moved forward to try and carve out a legal exception to the legal ban on consumption of marijuana. What I really want to accomplish today, having the opportunity to meet with individuals as yourself, especially the judges that are here. Ooh, so glad I didn't bring that. I still have a civil practice here in Hillsborough County that I have been involved in for more than 20 years. Very proud to be from Carlton Fields as well as Shook Hardy, two excellent large law firms, and I look forward to suing their clients regularly. But what I really want to talk to you about today is I want to engage in a conversation with you about some of the issues that are associated with this. And I think one of the benefits of having individuals who deal with the criminal courts is that I believe that you all have a superior perspective, and that's because you hear things like this in the public. You hear marijuana is as addictive as it is as opioids, or that the opioid problem, which is absolutely epic, is somehow tied to the legalization of cannabis that's been underway now for the last 2 decades. I think you understanding that from the perspective of dealing with the individuals that are in both of those camps, people who have teenagers who smoke marijuana or adults that are caught with marijuana, to compare those to individuals that rob and steal and cheat to get opioids is absurd. In fact, the data that is coming out is suggesting that the states where marijuana has been decriminalized or at least medicalized in some way are showing significant decreases associated with opioid addiction. Now, we can argue about causation or correlation, and that's where I'll leave that argument. I'm not a social scientist. In a way, I consider myself a journalist. I've been writing a blog now about marijuana since 2013. And why? I mean, I'm a Midwestern guy. I grew up in a small Midwestern town. I moved to Tampa in 1998 where I opened my practice. And how is it that I found myself in this issue? Well, I think what I love about this topic is that it's a little bit like Donald Trump. Now, what could he say next? Everyone has an opinion. This is not something where I appear at a luncheon and it's the first time that anyone has examined the issue of what the criminal laws should be about marijuana. Well, what would the marijuana laws look like if the people were in charge? Well, let's look at the state of Florida. How did Amendment 2 go? Now, the first time Amendment 2 was voted on in 2014, it failed. It was 57%. We required 60% to pass a constitutional amendment. Well, what data could we draw from the 2014 vote on Amendment 2 for Florida? Well, what we know is that more people voted for Amendment 2 than voted for our Attorney General. More people voted for Amendment 2 than voted for our governor. In fact, if you look at the governor's race in 2014, there was only a spread of 60,000 votes between Charlie Crist and our governor. How many more people voted for marijuana than didn't? 10 times that. 600,000 people more voted for Amendment 2 than voted against it. Now, fast forward to 2016, when the ballot, it's back on. Well, in 2014, there was a lawyer who was proposing the amendment, who was seen in some unsavory situations, making negative comments, and a lot of people believe that because he was so associated with the topic that he may have cratered it in 2014. But here it shows up again in 2016, and how did it go? Well, there's 67 counties in the state of Florida. Of the 67 counties, 67 had a majority vote in favor of Amendment 2. Of the 67 counties, 64 of those counties voted in favor of medical cannabis over the 60% limit. We had three counties just so happened to be in Miami, where there's predominantly students, in Tallahassee, where there are predominantly students, and in Tampa, where there are predominantly students. In those counties, it was more than 80%. So what we can draw from at least the data on the individuals, data, exit poll data not being the most accurate mechanism, but what we can draw from that is that there is a growing divide between the millennials and the older people. But the funny thing is, the older people come from a generation where cannabis was a cultural divider, because we're talking about events that were taking place in the late 60s. Well, is this the very first time that people in the United States have sought to push back against the criminalization of a plant? Well, it isn't, because after Nixon declared war on drugs in making it public enemy number one in 1971, in 1973 through 1978, more than a half a dozen states attempted to decriminalize cannabis, but were pushed back because of lobbying associated with anti-legalization efforts. Well, who was behind that? Well, let me take a short break and make this argument for you. Cannabis right now is being sold literally in cartloads. I was at a dispensary in San Francisco where there were 3 buildings that were producing 15 pounds of marijuana a day. And when I say producing it, meaning they had at various stages plants that were growing, plants that were curing, plants that were trimmed. But every single day out that door went 15 pounds of marijuana. Right around the time that I was there, California made its first run at adult use of cannabis. And when that happened, the first time, believe it or not, California voted it down. Well, we kind of scratched at that issue a little bit, and I talked with several of the people involved, a few of the California legislators, and I also spoke with some of the industry representatives. And this is the true statement that was made to me by several individuals. When a large grow operation in California produced a pound of marijuana, half of that product was being sold in their dispensaries. What happened to the other half? The other half was going out the back door, and it was coming to Tampa, Kansas City, wherever they could get it. Drug mules were charging approximately $5,000 a carload, and they would deliver that product to any place throughout the United States. As a proponent of legalization, or at least decriminalization, do I favor that? No. Here's my proposition. Cannabis should be regulated because I would rather we have a well-regulated legal product than a poorly regulated illegal one. Why? Well, who suffers the most? And I think the people in this room, especially the members of the court, would know the answer to that. When you have an ambiguous law, the people that suffer the most are the minority class, because those are the individuals that have greater exposure to law enforcement and have less resources. I used to joke when people would ask me about referring a criminal defense lawyer, I'd say, you know what, make sure the lawyer smokes pot. Why? And I'd say, well, let's look at it this way. If your lawyer can't get you out of a simple possession charge, I wouldn't hire him. I thought that was going to be funnier than it was. Sorry about that. Sorry. Okay. All right. So what we've been doing, and the group of individuals that I've put together, is we have been talking to people. We've been interviewing people. We've been gathering information. We've been talking to patients. We've been talking to families who suffer from issues associated with cancer or chemotherapy. And we're listening, because right now, the truth about the cannabis topic is that it's so dynamic. Things happen almost daily. And to illustrate that point, yesterday, the United States Senate had a committee hearing where the issue of re-upping FISA and different components of the Patriot Act. Now, I'm a civil libertarian, not a libertarian like a Republican libertarian that wants to get rid of the post office. No, I'm saying civil libertarian from the perspective of any law that exists, in my opinion, must be vetted for the impact it has on the civil liberties of the people it affects. And what we have now is an ambiguous situation. And an ambiguous situation will result in greater injury and harm to the minority classes. So what are we going to do about that? Well, marijuana is illegal, so we have to make it legal. Well, if you pass a law saying it's medicine, is that making it legal? Well, real simple way to say no. That's because it's not called the Food and Medicine Administration. It's not called the Medicine Enforcement Agency. It's the Drug Enforcement Agency. It's the Food and Drug Administration. You see, when California voted to create medical marijuana in 1996, after they passed the law, guess how many permits were sought within 12 months of passing the law? 0. What about the second year? 0. Third year? 0. Because no one knew how do you grow legal marijuana. But in 2001, a man, I'll call him Robert walked into the city hall in San Francisco, and he asked for a permit to legally grow marijuana. They didn't have one. And so he told them, if you don't give me one, I'm going to file, he said this to me, which I thought was interesting. He knew this. He said, I told him we were going to file a writ of mandamus. And I said, okay, maybe. How'd it go? And he said, well, I came back an hour later, and someone had sat at a typewriter and typed out what looked like a permit for the person to be able to grow legal marijuana. And so legal marijuana was born. And Robert goes up into the counties like Sonoma, because here's the thing: if you from a growing standpoint, what you have to understand about cannabis is, if you're in a community that grows wine, that's a great place to grow marijuana. They need the plants need they need sandy soils, and that's what you have, and they need these certain temperatures, and that's how it grows the best, and they produce these products. And that was in 2001. Well, since then, in California alone, they've sold literally billions upon billions of the product. So meanwhile, what's going on with the United States federal government that, through preemption, has control over cannabis? Well, the Controlled Substances Act is still in place. In fact, the original convention, the single convention on narcotics that was passed in 1961, is an international treaty that the United States is a signator upon. And so is Uruguay. Well, guess what? In 2014, Uruguay became the very first state to legalize marijuana. Well, wait a minute. You talk to people on the street and they'll tell you marijuana is legal. I thought we passed it. Didn't we legalize marijuana? No. What you did is essentially pass an act that is in direct violation with federal law. So what's the federal government going to do about it? Well, last week, or maybe the week before, we heard for the very first time formally from our United States Attorney General, Jeff Sessions. Now, Sessions is not making a big statement about cannabis. What he's really doing in his memo was contradicting the memo that had come out in 2013 with Eric Holder. Now, what a lot of people didn't understand about the Cole memo in 2013 was that it has absolutely no effect of law. All it did was establish what he called federal priorities. What are our priorities if we're the federal government and we are facing a national exponential growth in the sale of public marijuana? Because that's what I'm inviting you to call it. Don't call it legal marijuana, call it public marijuana, because that's what's happening. If you walk down the Haight-Ashbury area and you pass by the dispensaries in San Francisco, people are publicly selling it. It's not legal under federal law, but they're selling it. And so you get this memo from Cole, who was at that point the Deputy Attorney General under Eric Holder. And here's what his position was, and it is accurate. The federal government has never been involved in street sales of small quantities of cannabis. They never have been. That has always been an issue that has been left to the individual states. Where the federal government has always gotten involved would have to deal more with the interstate transfer of cannabis, or drug cartels, or other ways that they're selling it to children. And so what the Cole memo says is, we're interested in using federal resources where they can be the most effective. And where is that? Well, that would be the distribution of cannabis across state lines. That would be where we are dealing with an international criminal organization that is selling drugs within the United States. Or situations where we have, again, a deliberate attempt to sell drugs, cannabis, to children. Those were the things that they were suggesting were the federal priorities. As I look through here, obviously there's some other things in here that are important, that are things that people like me who want to reform America's medical marijuana laws, or marijuana laws generally, are looking for. And that's public health issues associated with driving automobiles, coming up with a mechanism to be able to determine if you got a stoned driver. Because right now that is extremely difficult, if not impossible, accurately. I did have an opportunity to talk to aldermen in Denver about this issue. And they had passed a temporary law that said that if you had 5 nanograms of THC metabolites in a quart of blood, you would be considered a stoned driver. And when we pushed further for what's the source of that? Is it 5 nanograms, not 6? Is it 4? Could it be 10? Where did you guys get this? And no one knew. And so they tossed it because they realized they were throwing darts at a board. Now you have Jeff Sessions coming out about 10 days ago, and all Sessions is really doing in that memo is saying to the U.S. attorneys, listen, marijuana is illegal. If you have a case against a medical marijuana grower, whether they're legal or otherwise, I'm telling you to enforce the laws against them. And in fact, he goes on in that memo and in other memos to talk about something that I think might be even more frightening, and that is the reversal on the idea of maximum penalty for all of these individual crimes. Because that's what he's telling the U.S. attorneys that he wants them to do. In fact, he even says in the memo, If you do not seek the maximum under the guidelines, you have to report that back to us, and we have the ability to come in and push it harder. So, okay, we get it. Jeff Sessions is that's his position, and that's what he says he's going to do with our federal resources. Okay, well, so what's he going to do? Okay, my understanding is, and this is what they'll publicly state or disclose to us, is that the DEA has about 5,000 agents. Okay, if you took and quadrupled the number of agents and then you sent them out across the United States to start arresting people for either selling or producing or distributing cannabis, you're not going to have the necessary resources for that. But here's the difficult thing. Even if the federal government does not move against public marijuana, they're going to do things like we heard happened last week, where 68 7-Elevens were raided by ICE looking for immigration violations. Well, I've been to more than 68 7-Elevens. Okay, I mean, how many 7-Elevens are there? And there might be 68 in the Tampa Bay area. But the reason they're doing that is to put fear in the heart of the 7-Elevens they didn't go to. I could see a situation where the federal government would do that. In fact, they did it. If you look back at the Cole memo under the Obama administration came out in October of that year. In November of 2013, the Obama administration ordered the raid of 26 dispensaries in Washington state. And here's what they did. They went in, they arrested everyone, they took all the plants, they took all the money, they took all the equipment, and then they disappeared. And they never came back. And then they let everybody go. And they never charged anybody. So you have this conflict even in the Obama administration, who, let's be honest, President Obama, when he ran for office, specifically said he would leave legal state marijuana alone. And then they still did random raids, I suppose, to try and bring the industry down. Well, in January of this year, the state of California began its adult use cannabis law. Here was the difference. Before, if you lived in California, you could purchase cannabis if you had a medical marijuana card. But of course, cannabis was everywhere. We were in Napa Valley, my wife and I were, for a couple of days, and the bartenders were the guys that were selling all of the cannabis. Even though Napa, up until recently, didn't have a cannabis dispensary. Why? Because they thought that it impacted their image globally. In fact, the plant that I'm showing you right now, the leaf, okay, guess where you will never see that plant? If you go into a dispensary in Denver, you'll never see it. If you pull up in front of a dispensary, you'll never see it. Because there's a specific law that you cannot publicly display the marijuana leaf anywhere near your dispensary. Now, I've asked why, but no one really tells me. My impression is that it's stigma. We've so stigmatized cannabis, more so than we have so many other recreational products that we use. I mean, we all know the statistic of the number of people who've died eating or died consuming marijuana. I tripped over eating because in order for you to overdose on cannabis, you would have to consume approximately 150 pounds of it in about 15 minutes. I've been to some crazy parties. Nobody ever tried that. All right. Now, so we have the federal government scheduling it under the Controlled Substances Act as a Schedule I drug. During the election cycle, if you look at the statements that were made by both now President Trump and then candidate Hillary Clinton, both of them appeared to be, they came out and said things like this. I think it's a state's issue. That's what Trump said. Hillary said, I think it's something we should study. Well, what chances do we have as a culture to medicalize cannabis? In 2009, the DEA accepted a petition on the rescheduling of cannabis. And from 2009 to 2016, they studied that issue. And here's how they did it. They made a request to the Health and Human Services Department to study the issues associated with the addictive qualities of cannabis, as well as to study the potential use of it as a drug. Now, I'm going to use that word specifically, drug, because here's what the real conflict is. The California experiment for legalizing cannabis was the idea that they would portray cannabis as a medicine in a sense that it could treat diseases, not just in terms of resolving them, but also treating symptoms. The most common symptom that my interaction, the people I talk to, has to do with the effects of chemotherapy. I interviewed a man who said he weighed about 175 pounds when I met him, but that he had weighed 240 2 years earlier until he got melanoma. He now has stage 4 melanoma. He has been able to use cannabis to keep him from wasting away while he's using the chemotherapy that he goes through. And it saves his life. Now, is that medicine? I think it is. Is it a drug? No, it's not. Because if you look at the petition where they denied the effort to reschedule it, their problem with it is that, well, it's not medicine because it's not a drug. Before I started my practice here in 2002, I spent 2 years traveling for Shook Hardy doing work on tobacco. And I had an opportunity to meet with just some of the most brilliant scientists about issues associated with disease and drugs and treatment. And during that exercise, we talked about the issue of what cannabis could be used for. But here's the reality of it. I accept the proposition that if Philip Morris could have figured out a way to turn cannabis into a drug and to sell it, they would have already done that. Well, has that happened? It has. There's two drugs. Everyone's heard of Marinol, but there's another one, Sesamet. Marinol is supposed to be the substitute for THC. Sesamet is supposed to be the substitute for CBD. CBD is a cannabinoid that shows up in most cannabis plants. Most cannabis plants are like gumball machines. They have different colors of gumballs in them and different quantities of them. Some plants have different gumballs. Some have more of one and not the other. Well, it's funny. If you put billions of dollars into research, it's amazing what you can discover. There are now people, scientists, who can literally grow THC and CBD in a laboratory. And of the 114 identifiable cannabinoids, they're able to grow most of those. And why would they want to do that? Well, the reason they would is because, back to my gumball analogy, they found a couple of gumballs that only appear every now and again. And they're never in large enough concentration in any particular breed of plant to be able to gather them. But, example, there is a cannabinoid called CBW. CBW, if you can create a kilogram of it, right now is being sold for $100,000 a kilogram. Because there is an association with CBW with a variety of neurological deficits, including Huntington's chorea. Now, if you've ever seen anyone with Huntington's disease, it's a horribly disfiguring condition where they will stretch their arms or their legs and they will strain. I interviewed a neurologist in Canada who had done a double-blind study using Sativex. Now, Sativex is 50% THC and 50% CBD. They were showing a 92% efficacy in dealing with Huntington's chorea within 15 minutes. Let me put that in really simple. We're talking about people that are right in front of you and they're suffering. They take what looks like a mouth spray, they go 1, 2, 3, and 15 minutes later, they are comfortable. So when you say to people like me, it's not medicine. Well, it has medical value because it affects the systems of the body in a very positive way. But the truth is, that doesn't mean that we should be providing these products, the cannabis, to children, obviously, or to people who can't make good choices for themselves. But the other reality is that I'm not saying that if you have never consumed cannabis, that you should go out and consume it. I'm not doing that at all. But I think you should be able to make that decision for yourself. If you look at the 17 most dangerous drugs that are approved by the FDA, they have killed, since 1996, the year that legal cannabis was passed, those drugs have killed more than 12,000 people associated with just regular use or overdose. Cannabis has never killed anyone, not directly. Now, it doesn't mean you shouldn't smoke a joint and drive a car. I don't believe you should do that. I think it should be used responsibly. But it doesn't matter what I think or what the law says. What we know is that more than 3 million people a year admit to smoking marijuana. Now, I'm always curious about those polls. Like, your phone rings, somebody calls you and goes, "Hey, do you smoke pot?" And you go, "Who is this?" No, I've never done that. That's what we know. But if you look at the quantity of product that's coming out of Colorado, last year we measured 144,000 pounds of marijuana were sold in Colorado. And is that a lot? Well, it's a lot. But think about this. The estimates right now is for the Los Angeles area, just Los Angeles, in 2018, it is estimated that they will sell 5 times as much cannabis as the entire state of Colorado. Now, if you think Colorado wasn't a big marijuana state, I'll tell you a cartoon I saw. And what it was a bus. And it had all these people, and they were all hanging out of the bus, and they all had a joint in their mouth. And it said, "Before marijuana legalization in Colorado." And then the next panel was the same people on the same bus smoking the same pot, and it said, "After legalization." Because the whole idea is, when you were a kid and you were told that if you smoke marijuana, you'll go completely insane. The problem with that presentation is that when your kid finds out that you lied, not that you lied, but maybe you spoke too harshly about cannabis, what the data suggests is that those are the individuals that are more likely to go on and experiment with more deadly drugs, as opposed to the presentation to a child that cannabis is something that adults do, you do not. If you do it, you can get in trouble, you can go to jail, you can lose your school, you can lose your scholarship, you can get kicked out of that private school that I pay that tuition for. But these are the drugs that are bad, and they are bad. I am not a proponent of legalizing cocaine, of course, or some of these other drugs. I'm not saying that we shouldn't decriminalize those to the extent that we have people who are users or abusers of those drugs. I don't think you put people in jail for that, especially not for some of the time they can get based upon, the sentencing guidelines under federal law. I've done very limited criminal defense work, but I did have an opportunity one time to work on a family court matter associated with a woman who had been arrested manufacturing methamphetamine. And this was back in 1997. And during that time period, methamphetamine was really the scourge of the Midwest. There were entire communities in Missouri, Iowa, and Nebraska that had been destroyed because they were excellent locations to produce methamphetamine. And so when your client has 275 boxes of Sudafed in their back seat, and you say, what were you doing with all the Sudafed? It was on sale. Okay. Why did you have a 55-gallon drum of acetone? Oh, it's fingernail polish remover. Okay. And what about the $35,000 in cash that you had? Well, we got that from Steve. Well, Steve was the one that turned her in. And when they found Steve, Steve had a bomb, 2 pounds of stage 1 meth, as my understanding is a lot of people could get meth to a certain point, but they had to have a cook who would come behind it. And he was arrested with a gun that was used in 2 murders. And so when I see that, and then I have a colleague who calls me and tells me that his son was caught at a Wendy's with 3 grams of marijuana and they want to put this kid in jail, I have a hard time reconciling those things. And so that's one of the reasons why I come here and I talked with you, because my purpose in this exercise is to get the information and to share it. I really avoid the conversation about a political association with these topics, a Republican or Democrat, because I can make the Republican argument. I thought Republicans believed in limited government. I thought Republicans believed in personal responsibility. I thought the Republicans believed in individual choice, but not when it comes to cannabis. So back to Florida. So we have medical marijuana in the state of Florida, but the products that they produce are horrible. And the reason for that is they've regulated it to the point where there are so few things that you can actually purchase that have active ingredient in them. Why? Because they don't want it to look like medicine. Like when I talk about medicine, I'm talking about chicken noodle soup that your grandmother used to make you when you had a cold. That's medicine. Makes you feel better, deals with some of the symptoms that you're facing. And that's what cannabis has an opportunity to do. But it also has an opportunity to provide other things. Specifically, CBD is associated with tumor reduction. I have a number of friends right now that have moved out to California because of illnesses that they have, either for themselves or for their children. And when you I have a 9-year-old daughter, and I met a man with a 9-year-old daughter who has never spoken in her life. She cannot walk, and she has about 200 seizures a day. Now, you say to somebody like that, why don't you move to California? They got all the weed you want. Well, here's the honest answer about that. For people who suffer from neurological deficits, cannabis only works about 30% of the time. Nobody said it was perfect. The other problem they have is they have a nanny who is a registered nurse. Well, this individual is very public about his position. He's even testified in front of Senate committees and House committees in Florida. But when he went back to his nanny and said, we want you to begin medicating her with this, she said, without reservation, I never want to hear about this again. I don't want you to bring that stuff around me. And if I see that anywhere near your daughter, I will go to the police and report you. And so he has his own business here. His wife has a job that she's had for 20 years. So if you say to them, well, if you're so motivated that cannabis is the solution of the problems that your daughter's having, you should move to California. They can't do that. So they continue to search for other options for their daughter. And I hope I never have to make those kinds of choices for my family. And I hope you don't either. If there are any questions that you guys want to start talking about or anything, or sharing stories? Yes, sir.
Why not are some of the attorney generals not taking the legal marijuana issue to the Supreme Court, arguing that the 14th Amendment is a states' rights issue? And why does that not, the pun intended, trump the federal government to a certain extent?
Yeah.
Sessions' absolute craziness of reversing the Obama just directive.
Right.
In other words, why wouldn't that be an issue someone would be looking at and taking up? Because that's a legitimate argument. Kind of odd that Sessions, a states' right guy, would do that.
Right.
This office.
Sure. Well, there have been 2 cases that have made it pretty far. I think one of them did go to the Supreme Court. One was back in 1980, and it wasn't on cannabis, it was on peyote. And it had to do with a group that was using peyote in ritualized medicine, Native American medicine.
Right.
And they said that the Controlled Substances Act trumps that. And then the same thing goes when they got pretty far along in the I think they did go to the Supreme Court on the issue of legalization, and essentially just said, again, the idea of state legal marijuana is a myth.
except you have X amount of states now have totally legalized it.
If you look at the response to the petition for declassification of cannabis, the DEA went out of their way to point out, oh, we get it. You guys are running around legalizing cannabis on all your state level. We understand that. But it really doesn't matter to us. In fact, they specifically said in their evaluation of the various elements that put you on Schedule 1, Schedule 2, or Schedule 3, they specifically pointed out, we did not consider in any way, shape, or form the status of marijuana in the states. We don't even care. We want to see you providing us something that looks like a drug, where you can have regular dosing, regular reaction. But there's an interesting thing about cannabis, and that is that not only is the individual user's experience very individualized, but also the plants themselves become very unpredictable. If you take a marijuana plant and it has seeds, if you have marijuana with seeds, you need to get new marijuana, by the way. Okay. But what was happening is that the plants are very unpredictable. If you take a plant and plant 6 of its seeds, all 6 of the plants can have entirely different profiles, just wildly varying. And because of that, the FDA and the DEA pointed out in the petition that they can't even find a consistent marijuana plant to study. So what they did in the evaluation was they didn't look at individual pieces, the CBD, or they didn't look at THC. They just said marijuana, and as far as they were concerned, no 2 states had the same definition for medical marijuana, and they don't. They all approach it very differently. And because of that, they're saying you're never going to get this through us to reschedule it. You're going to have to go and either change the Controlled Substances Act, or you're going to have to do what a lot of people are trying to do, which is to cut off the funding associated with enforcing federal law against state dispensaries. Yes, sir.
First a question, then an observation and a question. You familiar with the Warbacher Amendment?
That's what I'm talking about. With they cut off the funding for.
And that's been renewed about every 6 months for a few years now, my understanding.
Yeah.
I think in November, more recently, my understanding is that each time it gets renewed, it's very specific that it says the DEA, the federal government, cannot spend any money on enforcement for a state marijuana operation that is in compliance with their particular state laws. Is that your understanding as well?
That is my understanding.
Okay.
Yeah.
The second observation and question, when Jeff Sessions issued that recent memo, you're aware there's an exchange-traded fund on the New York Stock Exchange for marijuana businesses?
There is. I've got a funny story about
that memo, that fund dropped 22%. And does anyone think for a moment that people are not operating on that inside information?
These are great observations. The thing I'll tell you about some of the funds involving over-the-counter stocks, I talked with an investment banker at a known brand of investment banking firm, and they are specifically told, you are under no circumstances to ever invest any of our clients' money in any of those individual stocks. And if you're caught with it, we'll pull all of our business and we'll fire you. So that's kind of where they are. And why would they do that? Well, people like to talk about the amount of money that would be generated from taxing cannabis. So in 2030, they're estimating that cannabis sales will be right around $30 billion a year. That seems like a lot. Well, here's the thing. 2016, we sold $212 billion worth of alcohol. What do we know about cannabis? The data shows cannabis consumers drink considerably less alcohol, and they gamble a lot less. Well, think about all of the different moneyed interests that would be against the expansion of cannabis. If you're a real estate developer, and let's say you just built a new development in Orlando, Well, when you're looking at your numbers over a 30-year note, one of the things you're going to be calculating is the quantity or the money you're going to generate from the sale of alcohol. You don't want somebody starting to sell a product that's going to reduce your affection for alcohol. In fact, it's what I'm looking for, and I haven't found it yet. It's my argument that for every dollar of cannabis, you probably reduce your alcohol sales by $10. So it's not like we're going to substitute one taxed entity for something else. So there's a lot of people who are, I hope that the Rohrbach Amendment is something that will continue to hold back federal prosecutors, but I'm of the belief that there are other resources available to the federal government outside of that would allow them to harass the industry. Sir?
Doesn't tobacco fall into that same category as alcohol?
It does, and what's really cool about tobacco is it is the biggest hypocrisy of them all. Okay, right now the FDA, it was promulgated by the FDA as a rule, I think 3 years ago. They're coming out with a whole new line of tobacco products that the FDA is going to regulate. They have something called a modified risk tobacco product. Now, RJR has filed 35 applications to meet the definition of whatever a modified risk tobacco product is. But if you look at the labeling requirements, they specifically require you to put down the names of the carcinogens that are included in your product. And so let me get this straight. The FDA is going to allow the tobacco industry to sell a product where there is no dispute that it costs hundreds of thousands of lives every year. Now, I dispute the 400,000 a year number on tobacco for other reasons, but it's still a substantial number of people. But for the FDA to greenlight a product that kills people, but they won't proceed with cannabis. Well, why is that? Well, much of that simply has to do with the way the Controlled Substances Act talks about these products, because it would require you to do things with cannabis that you'd never be able to do. And then there's really the idea that going through the regulatory environment to try and convince the feds that it's a medicine, the time associated with that is insane. Just to review the petition to reclassify, they spent, 8 years? And they came out and said, we don't have enough data. I mean, look at the other ways the FDA has managed social issues, how they handled the AIDS epidemic, access to drugs back in the 80s. And remember, the FDA, as well as a lot of other federal agencies, were the agencies that failed to act when methamphetamine was roaring through the Midwest. Why? Because people were calling for them to reduce access to the constituent materials that were used to make methamphetamine, but the feds didn't want to do that because they were all being paid by these large moneyed interests in Big Pharma, who wanted to continue to sell over-the-counter cold medications, even though people were converting them to dangerous drugs. So we have the FDA being fully aware of the effect that their decisions have, either through tobacco or access to alcohol, but the political pressure isn't enough. Why not? The political pressure of me telling you that 71% of the people in the state of Florida voted for Amendment 2. But see, then you go and meet with the legislators. So I had an opportunity to meet about 3 months ago with Senator Jack Lotvala. Remember him? Yeah, Jack was we were talking about a bill that he was obviously we're not gonna do that now. That's frustrating. That's the second time that's happened. There's another legislator we were working with who got arrested for something petty, and Lotvala went down because of the sexual harassment allegations. So that's frustrating. Yes, sir.
So for the criminal defense lawyers, processing out loud probably what will be ignorance, but I mean, we know that police officers use the smell of cannabis as a classic search tool.
Pretext, sure.
And I was kind of joking with my associate yesterday that I'm sure that they declare what kind of cannabis they were smelling later in their oral testimony versus, well, I smell marijuana, but then suddenly it's like, Well, can you truly smell vegetative marijuana that's locked in 3 Ziploc bags in the back of the car where nobody smelled and it's only 50 grams? I honestly have no clue what the answer to that question is. But knowing that it's hard to prove a negative, that we're going to prove that you didn't smell anything when they find something, my question is, what does the medical cannabis law do you think allow criminal defense lawyers to argue concerning, well, hey, cannabis is legal at some level in the state, so is what you're smelling going to be potentially a legal product, therefore it's no longer a grounds to search your car?
I think it's imperative that that individual defendant would need a medical marijuana card, so they're meeting the minimum requirements. But in states like Florida, getting a medical marijuana card is very difficult. The standards for getting it is impossible. And if a doctor is seen overriding medical marijuana prescriptions, they have the ability to arrest the doctor unless he's got a basis to give them the prescription. Yes, sir.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but grass form is still not legal.
Okay.
Not under the current Florida medical marijuana law.
Well, if the current medical marijuana law, when it came, 1397 was the bill. The original bill that passed the House would not allow you to smoke it. It would not allow you to vape it, and it wouldn't allow you to eat it. So the only way we could find was we found a product in Colorado that was a suppository. And so my point was, y'all know what the line here is, right? What was Florida telling people to do with their medical marijuana? But you're absolutely right.
To address Mike's question,
Yeah.
you're not allowed to have it legally in a
Yeah.
floral form, whatever the term
Yeah,
is.
there's no, we call them flowers.
Right, so you still can't, if you
Yeah.
have that, the pretextual stop is still applied. There's no.
That's right.
There's no way of. Right, unless the vape smells or unless there are pills.
The vape is, yeah, it's interesting. It doesn't have the same, and it doesn't have the, I mean, let's face it, you light a joint, I mean, it travels. I mean, you can smell that stuff a long way away. Yes, sir.
I had the experience several years ago. My husband had AIDS, and he was given Marinol for wasting syndrome. Didn't work worth a crap.
Didn't work.
No, I gave it to him. I was a PD at the time, not a state, which I was later. But we gave it to him, and well, I came back. He was sitting in the bedroom naked, stoned, and hadn't eaten a thing. He lost 50 pounds, and then they gave him eggs and gave him food. But the point I'm getting at is that we had to fill out federal forms for him to get the eggs. It wasn't just a state thing. We had to fill out federal forms and go through a whole dog and pony show. He had a legitimate doctor giving him a legitimate pill, which is really just liquid THC.
What was the year that happened?
1994.
Yeah, because that was before any of the states had passed it, and I think what you were doing was you were getting an exception, and they, because of, in fact, the whole birth of medical marijuana came out of the AIDS epidemic.
Yeah.
Because so many people in California were wasting away. It's just a horrible, horrible condition. Yeah, but the marijuana makes a really big difference, and I can tell you that. As I mentioned, and I think we're about done. My journey is to gather the information and to share it and to invite discussion about it, to educate people. Because one of the things that I love about this topic is that it breaks down party lines. People who are the most conservative people I've ever met. A gentleman who was a lieutenant colonel called me, and he found my name, and he called me and he told me that his mother was dying and he wanted to see if cannabis could save her. And he made a big point of saying, you gotta understand how desperate I am if you know who I am. But then at the same time, I know people that are as liberal as they can possibly be, and they grow marijuana on their patios. And so it's that idea that there's a common element here. And I think the common element is that I'm pushing back on the big government. I mean, I have a medical marijuana card in Florida under complicated circumstances. I had to file an application with the state of Florida. My name is on a list that says I am a felon to consume cannabis in this way. So, but that's what I had to do, because in Florida, you don't just walk in and they give you a script. You have to take the script and your medical file and upload it to a website that's controlled by the state. And then the state tells the doctor whether he can write the script. Yes, sir.
Well, it's not really a script, right? It's a recommendation, because if they write a prescription, that involves the federal government and the FDA, so it's really a recommendation.
Well, the federal government's come out and said that they protect the doctor's First Amendment rights to tell you to use cannabis. And the reason I will call it a script is because in Florida, you can't just say it's not a yes or no. Here, use this, yes, you can use marijuana. You have to put dosing down. You have to tell, so you don't get a certain defined quantity of marijuana, you get a certain quantity of the cannabinoids. Like, I was prescribed 900 milligrams of cannabinoids a month. I can't really, yes.
Isn't that the same as every other drug though? You don't just get a big bag of penicillin, you get the whole.
It is, but I
figure it
don't,
out.
right, it is, but I don't think marijuana is a drug. I don't. I mean, because that's the thing, is that you should go to some of the festivals. I have to tell you, that is a good time. Yes, sir.
THC is psychoactive, so what's your belief that it's not a drug?
THC is
You agree
psychoactive.
THC is psychoactive,
Right.
okay?
Yeah, I agree. But is that your definition of a drug? It's psychoactive?
I don't know, I just know that I kind of associate psychoactivity with drugs, yes?
Well, if you've ever had my ex-wife's cooking. Yeah, right. But, well, I think here's the point. You're probably right and I'm probably wrong. But the issue for me is all of my colleagues, if I say on the left of me, would say, let's continue to fight the fight to prove it's a drug that can be managed and the feds are cool with. My position is that's a fool's errand because everything's already been set against you. The standards that they're looking for, marijuana will never meet, and marijuana needs to be regulated like alcohol. And Mike was asking me earlier about these issues, about defending these cases. And I interviewed a lawyer in Miami Michael Minardi, a hell of a good lawyer, really good defense lawyer, who was successful, I think, a couple of times on medical defense as a defense to, a medical necessity as a defense to possession, and he was successful. Part of that is simply that there are a lot of courts that are reporting that during jury selection on drug cases associated with marijuana, people are just saying, I can't convict anybody of this. I can't. There's a lot of jury nullification going on. Obviously I don't propose that because I don't think that's the answer. I'd rather we just get to it and we sit down as a society and decide what our boundaries are, and I want to make my own choices, and I think everybody else wants to do as well. So I appreciate all of your attention. I invite you to check out News Munchies, my blog. We have a lot of fun. We put a lot of interesting people up in front of you, and I'd love to hear your perspectives as well. Thank you so much.